Chapter 13, the sections go their ways. And again, we're referring to North and South here. And we'll be looking at the causes of the Civil War, the emergence of Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. We'll look at the demise of the two-party system with the rise of the Know-Nothing Party and the Republican Party. What's been called Bleeding Kansas as turmoil over the slavery issue manifested. And we'll look at the Dred Scott decision, the elections of 1856 and 1860, John Brown's raid, and then this chapter will end with the secession of South Carolina and 6 of the lower South states from the Union. Slave catchers in the North. One of the last things we talked about in Chapter 12 was the Compromise of 1850. And this compromise only lasted 4 years because 2 of its central provisions were extremely controversial. And one of them was allowing the new territories to have popular sovereignty. Remember, they were deciding for themselves whether or not their territory would be slave or free. And that ensured constant agitation over the issue of slavery in those territories. And probably a bigger issue was the harsher fugitive slave law that was enacted as a provision for the South. So the stronger fugitive slave law said that if a slave escaped from the South to the North, then they had to be returned. And if someone was caught harboring a slave, they would be punished, and obviously the slave who was a fugitive would be punished as well. Well, many Northerners refused to cooperate with that law altogether, and abolitionists in the North often interfered with its enforcement. Not to mention, in some states in the North, the law became really difficult to enforce. And of the 332 fugitive slaves or alleged fugitive slaves that went to trial, 300 of them were sent back to the South. But there were some instances where masters were claiming free blacks as fugitive slaves when they had been living as free blacks all along. So the Southerners accused the North of reneging on the Compromise of 1850 and their promise to enact this harsher fugitive slave law. Another precursor to war was Uncle Tom's Cabin, which you read for summer reading. And this, of course, was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, becoming an immediate bestseller. It added to the sectional tensions, and it really brought home the evils of slavery to many Northerners. Interestingly, Stowe wasn't a professional writer and had almost no firsthand knowledge of slavery, but she was roused by the Fugitive Slave Act. So this book generated opposition in the North, and of course Southerners accused it of distorting plantation life. The Young America movement. And this one really didn't have much to do with sectional tensions between North and South or the oncoming of the Civil War. It more or less served as a distraction from war. And some of the causes of this movement were manifest destiny, for one, which led to a search for new markets and this desire to spread democracy all throughout the world. And again, just a need for a distraction from sectional tensions. So America embarked on an aggressive foreign policy movement, and this is what it's been called, the Young America movement. And so these people were confident that democracy would and should spread everywhere. And this expansionist sentiment encouraged an American physician and lawyer, and I think mercenary, William Walker, to try to gain control of Nicaragua. And so he successfully seized control of Nicaragua and elected himself president. Unfortunately for him, he was ousted 2 years later. But he made repeated attempts to seize control of Nicaragua until he died in 1860 by a firing squad. Another effect of this movement was the beginnings of talking about a canal that would run through Central America. And we know this eventually would become the Panama Canal, but this began a little bit earlier. So in 1850, Secretary of State John Clayton and British Minister to the U.S., Henry Bulwer, negotiated a treaty that provided for the demilitarization and joint Anglo-American control of any canal across the Central American Isthmus. And so, especially with the development of California, it necessitated better communication with the West Coast. And so a canal through Central America would cut sailing time from San Francisco to New York down by weeks. And so this obviously wouldn't manifest until like 1914, I think. But as a result of the Young America movement, talk of this canal began in 1850. Also, America had long been interested in Cuba, and that interest increased after discussion about building a canal through Central America. So President Franklin Pierce actually attempted to buy Cuba from Spain for $130 million, but Spain refused to sell it. And so news of this attempt outraged Northerners who saw it as a slaveholders' plot to perpetuate the institution of slavery. And so the government was forced to disavow the Austin Manifesto along with any other plans for acquiring Cuba. Another effect of this movement was Commodore Perry's expedition to open Japan, and this took place in 1854. And so the Japanese, who were very impressed by our naval power, agreed to diplomatic relations. All right, the Little Giant. This is referring to a guy named Stephen Douglas, and he was the most prominent spokesperson for the Young America movement. He had served 2 terms in the House of Representatives and then became a senator. He was called the Little Giant because he was 5'4". So he was about my height. So Douglas based his politics on expansion and popular sovereignty. The idea, again, that the state should decide whether or not their territory would be slave or free. So he wanted railroads, he wanted new territory, he wanted the expansion of trade, all of which would fuel the economy. And although he opposed the expansion of slavery to the territories, he refused to acknowledge that any moral issue was involved. I think really he just wanted the issue settled so that they could move on and expand and make more money. And I think honestly he believed that slavery would die out anyway over time. So he just wanted to kind of get past that issue. And Douglas had wanted the Democratic nomination for president in 1852, but the party chose Franklin Pierce over him. And so Pierce actually, even though he was a dark horse candidate who kind of came out of nowhere, he easily defeated the Whigs nominee, which was General Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican-American War. And I'll just use that to say that the Whig Party was rapidly disintegrating. The quote-unquote cotton Whigs of the South were alienated by the anti-slavery opinions of Northern Whigs, and so they flocked to the Democratic Party. And the Southern Democrats controlled Congress, which actually disturbed both Democrats and Whigs in the North. So you can see, even with political parties, things were lining up sectionally. So the South would be predominantly Democrat, and the North would predominantly be Republican. Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Stephen Douglas wanted the Nebraska Territory organized so that he could open the region for a transcontinental railroad. And the Southerners opposed this plan. They wanted a southern route. Moreover, Nebraska lay north of the Missouri Compromise line and would presumably become a free state. So in an effort to gain Southern support, Douglas agreed that he would divide the territory into Kansas and Nebraska and repeal the Missouri Compromise prohibition of slavery north of the 3630 line. And he, again, pushed this idea of popular sovereignty, which he said would decide the status of slavery in those 2 territories. And this, of course, caused outrage in the North as a free territory would become open to slavery. And in spite of strong opposition in the North, he mustered enough support to pass the bill. So Stephen Douglas pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through, and this at this point was probably the greatest step towards secession and civil war. New political parties. Two new parties emerged from the demise of the Whigs, and they were the American, or the Know Nothing Party, and the Republican Party. And the Know Nothings espoused a nativist platform. The name came from its development out of a secret society whose password was, "I don't know." So nativist issues kind of cut across sectional lines, and the party had support in all sections. And they played on people's fear of increasing immigration, which was causing social problems. And so the Know Nothings promised to purify American politics by limiting or ending the influence of Irish Catholics and other immigrants, thus reflecting nativism and anti-Catholic sentiment. It was empowered, again, by the popular fears that the country was being overwhelmed by German and Irish Catholic immigrants, whom they saw as hostile to Republican values and controlled by the Pope in Rome. And so it was kind of like an enemy to democracy. Membership to this party was kind of limited to Protestant men, as it took an anti-Catholic stance. There were a few prominent leaders, and the largely middle-class membership sort of fragmented over the issue of slavery. Most members of this party disliked blacks, so the party tended to adopt the view of slavery predominant in whichever section they were located. So in the North, they would have been anti-slave; in the South, pro-slavery. So the Free Soilers, the conscious Whigs, and the anti-Nebraska Democrats banded together to form the Republican Party. And support for the Republican Party came almost exclusively from the North. Republicans weren't necessarily abolitionists. Rather, they wanted to keep slavery out of the territories, primarily to maintain exclusive access to the West for free white labor. Bleeding Kansas. The status of slavery in Kansas became a national issue as abolitionists and defenders of slavery attempted to control the territory. Like, people literally moved into that territory so that they could vote for or against slavery in that area. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas and helped to elect a pro-slavery territorial legislature in 1855. So the census showed that 3,000 Kansans were eligible votes, but 6,300 showed up to vote. Anti-slavery settlers elected a legislature of their own. So there were actually two governments operating in Kansas, and one was operating in fraud, the other was extra legal. So this involved a presidential response. So President Pierce denounced the Free State government at Topeka and encouraged the pro-slavery forces to take the offense, or the offensive. So 800 pro-slavery people sacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. And in retaliation, a guy named John Brown, who was an anti-slavery extremist, and his followers murdered 5 pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek. And so this issue brought men on both sides to arms. It came to blows, and Brown and his 6 followers escaped capture and were actually never indicted for those murders. John Brown eventually went into hiding, left Kansas, and by that point, about 200 people had been killed. He was eventually tried and executed by hanging. On the day he died, he wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." So you can see that things are really coming to blows here between the North and the South and this issue of slavery. So another interesting thing that happened was the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. So in 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts attacked the Kansas-Nebraska Act and demanded that Kansas be admitted as a free state. And so he savagely berated Douglas and Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina for defending this act. So Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, took it upon himself to defend his uncle's honor by beating Sumner with a cane on the floor of the Senate, after he ridiculed him for the drool that came out of his mouth when he talked. So Brooks became a Southern hero, like people were sending him canes in the mail. And Northerners regarded the incident as evidence of the brutalizing effect of slavery and considered Sumner a martyr. So Sumner's life wasn't really threatened, but he was afraid to return to Congress until 1859, where he served for 18 more years. And Brooks resigned after a hearing, but was reelected and then died prematurely at age 37. So we'll stop here for this video, and we'll pick up tomorrow with the election of 1856.